everyone. Thank you for coming, and it is a delight to be here, especially as an American. I find some encouragement in the dramatic improvements, the reforms that South Korea is adopting right now. As an American, this is important to see because, as we discussed a moment ago with a few of us, it can probably be said that your country and mine are moving in opposite directions at the moment on the matter of corruption. At a moment when South Korea is, in my impression, is going through a dramatic cultural shift and a legal shift, suddenly in my country, we're asking, how much do Americans actually care about corruption? It's very startling. My answer to every question you might ask about what is happening in my country politically is, I don't know. I don't understand. But at any rate, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the remarkable moment that South Korea is going through, one that has been my privilege to study for the last couple of years. I want to ask what South Korea teaches us about the Olympic anti-corruption movement. As we know, for about 20 years, the issue of corruption in the Olympic Games has been in the middle of our radar. New forms of corruption are arising now, and they require new measures. Meanwhile, South Korea, in the years leading up to the Pyeongchang Games, has adopted a number of dramatic anti-corruption reforms, and culturally, I think, as well, has gone through a shift in attitudes towards certain kinds of behavior that might be called corruption. What does this teach about what the Olympics might be able to do in the future to stimulate anti-corruption reforms in the host country? I'd like to talk about that for a little bit, and I'd like to do this truly in the form of a workshop, meaning I would love for people to ask questions or share comments just as often as you can. I have a fair amount of material, but it's all in the form of a stimulation to discussion. So please share comments as they occur to you. Legacy. The word legacy is very widely used in Olympic policy discussions. There is a new office in the International Olympic Committee dedicated to the concept of legacy. What is a legacy? The term legacy encompasses all the tangible and intangible long-term benefits initiated or accelerated by the hosting of the Olympic Games for people, cities, territories, and for the Olympic movement. So the idea of a legacy is the Olympics should leave a lasting positive effect in the host city and the host country. The Olympics, of course, are very expensive. They are a major undertaking. Why would a host city agree to do this? Well, it must be because there is some kind of lasting benefit to the host city, to the host country. What would that benefit be? It can be tangible or intangible. Things like a stadium and trains and so forth, but also intangible benefits, as we'll discuss. They can be initiated by the Olympics or simply accelerated. What are some examples of different Olympic legacies? We talk about the economic legacy. What is the long-term economic impact of hosting the Games? The economists are fairly confident, fairly unified in their view that at present, that legacy is a negative legacy, that the Games do not produce economic benefits equal to or greater than the costs. The International Olympic Committee is working on ways to reduce the costs, so we think that legacy can become stronger in the future. But there are many other kinds of legacy as well. We talked about the sport legacy. Do the Olympics stimulate the development of a sporting culture, sporting organizations within the host country? I listened to someone speak of the very positive benefits that the 1988 Seoul Summer Games had on the development of a sporting culture in South Korea. There's increasing talk of an environmental legacy. Notably, as you drive into Pyeongchang, what's the first thing that I see that most of us would see? The windmills. And the remarkable efforts that Pyeongchang has taken to become an environmentally sustainable Olympic Games. Excuse me. There's a concept of a political legacy. Now, this is not nearly as positive a legacy. The political legacy refers to the ways that a country can host the Games to project power, to project an image to the rest of the world. And the two recent examples of this are Sochi, right? Where it's widely understood that Vladimir Putin sought the games in order to make a symbolic statement to the world that Russia has emerged as a true international power. Maybe China had done that with its previous Olympics as well. The most famous original example of a political legacy was 1936, Adolf Hitler, where Hitler was the first to think that the Olympics could be used to bring legitimacy to the state and to project power, an image of power to the world. Are we seeing today the emergence of a new kind of legacy, a different kind of legacy, different than any that we've seen before? What we might call an anti-corruption legacy. Okay? Let's talk about what an anti-corruption legacy might be. I would define it as a series of laws, practices, and cultural norms promoting transparency and accountability that have application beyond sport and will remain after the games are gone. So, laws, practices, and cultural norms, okay, that would promote transparency, promote accountability, that would be bigger than just the sport themselves, that would have application beyond sport, and once the Olympics are gone, would remain in place. Why do we think an anti-corruption legacy is possible? A few reasons. Okay? The first one is what's happening in this country. Okay? Remarkable, stunning, the cultural and legal shifts that, as far as I can tell, are taking place in this country on the eve of hosting the Olympic Games. Now, I don't think the Games get any of the credit for this. So far as I can tell, this is purely an organic movement within South Korea, very much to the credit of this country. But it is still an example of a host country being in a position legally, economically, and culturally such that it is ready to adopt dramatic reforms while it is also ready to host the Olympic Games. And that is not unique to South Korea. Think of other recent or future host cities. Brazil hosted the 2016 Games. You may not have followed that story carefully, but Brazil, much like South Korea, had some inherited corruption challenges. You saw a grassroots political movement demanding corruption reforms. The legislature responded by adopting a landmark anti-corruption law called the Clean Companies Act, and another law called the Organized Crime Bill, which gave prosecutors tools that they needed to address corruption. What then happened in the wake of these reforms? You may have read about this in the papers or heard about it, Operation Car Wash. The massive anti-corruption enforcement action may be the largest anti-corruption enforcement action in history in any country, right? Made possible by these legal reforms. Right? So Brazil, as it was preparing to host the Games, was also going through a dramatic anti-corruption moment, much like South Korea, interestingly. Think of China. China today, its motives are many, but regardless, China has initiated one of the most aggressive and far-reaching anti-corruption enforcement efforts in the world. So much so that people are asking credibly, has China gone too far in enforcing anti-corruption laws? Is it causing collateral harm? Who, 5 years ago, would have thought that we would be discussing that today? Okay. China is hosting the 2022 Olympics. And the next Olympics, 2024, is France. France, as you may know, is also going through a dramatic anti-corruption moment. It also has just adopted a landmark anti-corruption law called Sapin II, just last year. So there is a remarkable pattern here that the host countries to the Olympic Games have, at the same time they have sought and received the bids, have also adopted historic anti-corruption reforms. Not just yet another law and a couple isolated prosecutions of the sort that we see periodically in any well-governed country. These are dramatic, landmark anti-corruption laws. Okay? There is a pattern here. What do we make of that pattern? How can we develop its potential? There are a couple exceptions to this rule. Okay. One would be Russia. Russia in 2014. Russia is an example of a country that was facing dramatic corruption allegations, but did not adopt meaningful anti-corruption reforms, very much different from these other countries. For every Olympic Games, the International Olympic Committee enters into a contract with the host city. Okay? This is a legally enforceable contract. That contract contains a number of provisions. It's enormous, even hundreds of pages long. The file that the host city prepares in trying to win the bid, it's called a candidature file, that becomes incorporated into the contract. So this is a massive contract. But the IOC has a model host city contract that it uses for each host city and then adapts to the local circumstances. Just last year, the model host city contract was amended to include this clause. It says that the host city and the Olympic organizations within the country must refrain from any act involving fraud or corruption in a manner consistent with any international agreements, laws, and regulations applicable in the host country and all internationally recognized anti-corruption standards applicable in the host country, including by establishing and maintaining effective reporting and compliance. That's important. I cannot help but think that those who drafted this clause saw what was happening in South Korea and saw there an opportunity. I cannot help think that they thought, why can't we do what South Koreans are doing, right, on a more regular basis and as an intended effect of hosting the games rather than the coincidence that we have seen in South Korea. The IOC gets none of the credit for all of the reforms occurring in South Korea. But I think the IOC would like to stimulate some of these reforms. And why? Because the anti-corruption scandals are bad for the Olympic brand. They damage the games. They damage their value. And the IOC, seeing what happened in Russia, seeing what's since happened in Brazil and South Korea, wants to address this problem. Of the story in South Korea, and I here would very much invite others to fill in the gaps. I'm sure there are many gaps. But as we have tried to understand the context in which the important legislative reforms and important enforcement actions have taken place, two features have come to our mind. Now, again, in the United States, I'm not sure I could even explain all the things that contribute to the situation we are now facing. But in South Korea, it does seem that there were two that have stood out to us. Maybe there are others. I would invite people to make comments. But the one was the culture of gift giving, which we understand arises out of a Confucian worldview, which emphasizes maintaining social relationships and affirming a person's social status. And I think this has actually been one of the most beautiful areas of South Korean culture that we have studied in these last 2 years, because in the United States, we don't have a gift-giving culture. And we are not nearly as relationship-oriented a society as South Korea, I think to our deficit in many ways. And as we have studied South Korea, we have seen the way that these gifts had two meanings at the same time. And this is very difficult for a Westerner to understand, but I think very important for a Westerner to understand. My impression from talking to people is that many of the gifts were at the same time, at the very same time, a genuine expression of respect or affection and a calculated effort to purchase favorable treatment. At the same time. Not one or the other, both. I had many conversations with people which led me to believe this. Particularly, a couple of professors who I've spoken to, not here at Yonsei, who were obviously very troubled by the gift-giving provision of the Kim Young-ran Act. And I think of one professor at a very prominent law school who I sat down with Young is laughing back there. So Young was we met at Fordham University where he was finishing his SJD, and he agreed to be my host. And he and I came for my first week in South Korea, and he introduced me to a number of people. So he was present for this conversation. But a professor who spoke about the new Kim Jong-un Act with a degree of bitterness and resentment that even to the perspective of this newcomer so clouded his judgment that I could tell the things he was saying did not make sense, were not right. And I listened to this. This was a very, very intelligent person, very well educated. And I listened to this and I thought, why is he talking like this about it? I don't understand. But as I talked more and I listened and I reflected, this is what I came to understand, that I think for this professor, the gift-giving prohibition took away from him something that was very important. Not just the money, not just the gifts. It wasn't about the gifts. It was the demonstration of respect and affection and dignity that he as a professor was accustomed to receiving. And the law took that from him. And that professor sitting in that chair talking to me was a man from whom something had been taken from him, something very precious, and he was angry. I think that was happening. Now, again, to a Westerner, that's very hard to understand. When we hear gifts, we just think, oh, that's corruption. We don't see the relationship-oriented dimension of gift-giving, and so we have a hard time appreciating the cost of a prohibition such as this, and the intensity of the cultural shift that is occurring when you adopt a gift-giving prohibition. As one corporate lawyer said to us, this is one of the most powerful moments in all of my research, talking with a corporate lawyer downtown in Seoul, and he said, the Kim Jong-un Act forces us to learn how to express our feelings in new ways. Wasn't that a powerful comment? And so, my understanding of the context is there was this gift-giving culture which was not purely corrupt by any means. It was partly sincere and partly an effort to purchase influence. Another professor who spoke with a similar sense of regret and disappointment about the deprivation that he was feeling. Several minutes later, in another context, I asked him, so what percentage of these gifts that you would receive, what percentage of them do you think were designed to purchase favorable treatment? And he said, without even pausing, 95. You see, these gifts that were so important to him, he saw were also an effort to purchase favorable treatment. And so that is part of is my impression, is part of the cultural context in which these dramatic reforms are taking place, and illustrates how important, how significant the cultural shift really is that's going on now. In fact, when we were here in March, we interviewed some other corporate lawyers who said this was so interesting. They said, look, the penalties for corporations under the Kim Jong-un Act are quite low. Those by themselves would not change our behavior very much. But many of these Korean companies are also subject to UK jurisdiction or United States jurisdiction or other jurisdictions. And there are laws there which maybe should be changing our behavior, but we feel kind of removed from them. We feel far away from them, and so they don't have quite the effect. And the Kim Jong-un Act brings us to a tipping point where now we decide, okay, the US is telling us to do this, the UK is telling us to do this, now Korea is telling us to do this, okay, we'll do it. And so you see this convergence of different national laws changing behavior within a certain country. The other side I understand to be the role of the chaebol. And my understanding of the chaebol story is something roughly like this. After the Korean War, to stimulate economic development, South Korea had a very strong and very powerful centralized president, President Park, who worked closely with these family-run conglomerates. That relationship between a strong centralized power and these and a relatively small number of very large family-owned businesses, that partnership was very effective in stimulating economic growth. And indeed, South Korea became a so-called Asian tiger, in some part as a result of this partnership between the government and the chaebol. That served an important purpose for many decades. But there came a time when the collateral effect of this partnership, namely the corruption, which would happen inevitably when you have a small number of powerful companies interacting with a centralized, not particularly transparent political regime. That's a recipe for corruption anywhere in the world. And so the corruption that inevitably came to be felt by Koreans as a cost that they were no longer willing to pay and felt didn't have to pay. That we're now in a different, we have recovered. We are the 12th largest economy in the world today. This is no longer about desperately stimulating economic recovery from a war. We are past that. And now we just want to have good corporate governance, good well-behaving public officials, standards of transparency and accountability. We're at that stage in our economic development where we can now make that shift. 50 years ago, we were less concerned about corruption than we were about economic development. We're now at a stage where we can engage the corruption issue. And so, my impression is that these were the chaebol plus the gift giving were the two principal historical forces that created this inherited challenge, and that the reforms addressed head on. The catalyst that brought South Korea to the point where it was willing to adopt major reforms was the Sewol ferry disaster, which I understand was attributed to the negligent enforcement of safety standards that was itself due to corruption. And that became a very high-profile event in Korean history and impacted the political mood in a way that led to these reforms. First was the prohibition on gift giving beyond a certain minimal amount to a fairly broadly defined category of public officials, to include even members of the media and private school teachers, which, by the way, in the anti-corruption space is a cutting-edge provision. The definition of public official is one of the big issues in international anti-corruption law today, and I have never heard of a definition as broad as this one. South Korea is very much setting the bar in this regard. Now, I understand that that definition was amended during the legislative process. There are stories about what may have driven those amendments. My understanding is that they're only stories. Whatever the case, this was the effect of the law, and it's quite powerful. And again, it's both a legal shift and a cultural shift. Then the second is creating corporate liability for bribery. And here I feel like we don't understand this as well as we should. So I would encourage people to clarify for us. But my understanding, our understanding, is that bribery was previously handled under the criminal code, and that South Korea did not recognize corporate criminal liability. And so in the absence of a provision creating corporate criminal liability, there was no way to impute liability to a corporation for the bribery of its employees. But compliance is, in the anti-corruption space, central to the effort to deter corruption, and is really emerging in the last 10 years or so as the principal anti-corruption tool. What is compliance? So corporate compliance refers to the systems an organization, think a company, but not necessarily a company, puts in place to prevent, detect, and respond to violations of law or of self-defined standards of conduct. Okay? We refer to compliance programs. What's a compliance program? Compliance program is where a company moves well beyond just deciding we're going to see what we can do to not break the law. It's much more systematic and much more cost-intensive than that. It's where a company identifies the laws that it's subject to where the risk of a violation is particularly high. It does a risk assessment and can invest a lot of money in this risk assessment. Okay? So too, might it develop a code of ethics. We talked about codes of ethics earlier. Code of ethics or code of conduct. But then it will put systems in place to train employees, to monitor conduct. Okay? It will have systems to detect misconduct And it will adopt systems so that if misconduct occurs, and it always does, no compliance program is perfect or ever could be. But when a violation occurs, the company responds in a meaningful and prompt and effective way. Okay? And the compliance industry in the United States, at least, has existed for maybe 30 years, but really, or 40 years, but really accelerated after the 2000 or 2002 with the major accounting scandals that occurred in the United States. Think Enron, WorldCom, and so forth. We went through a period of devastating corporate fraud, where many people lost enormous amounts of money, and there was much harm beyond that. We passed an important law called Sarbanes-Oxley, which, in ways that we won't discuss now, stimulated the development of this compliance industry. Okay? But compliance, notice, is a company or an organization spending the money to deter its own violations. Okay? And because this is the company incurring the costs, this, I would say, is the most efficient, cost-efficient tool the government has to deter corruption or any other kind of misconduct. The trick is to incentivize companies to adopt compliance programs. If a government can effectively incentivize companies to adopt compliance programs, the compliance programs will do the work. Not perfectly, of course, but do a substantial portion of the work. And that's really the goal. Compliance programs is the most powerful tool and is the center of the anti-corruption movement. This compliance industry that I'm talking about, who does it touch? Who participates in it? Many different sectors. Okay? Or I should say many different industries. Okay? First of all, law enforcement. Okay? The prosecutors might be involved in evaluating compliance programs to decide whether, in fact, you had an adequate program in place at the time of the violation. Courts can be involved in this as well. And they can hand out rewards based on the quality of the compliance program. Industries, seeing the writing on the wall, might adopt compliance programs, either because they want to protect themselves from liability, or they want to avoid the reputational harm that comes when a prosecution occurs. Sometimes companies aren't particularly afraid of the prosecution or the penalty, but they are afraid of the harm that can come to their reputation as a result. And so companies will start to adopt compliance programs. Law firms in the United States, the big corporate law firms are making a mint out of the compliance industry. How? Because they're involved in consulting companies designing the compliance programs. When a violation might occur, part of the compliance program will be to hire an outside law firm to help with the investigation, the internal investigation of the company. That's big money for law firms. And then finally, when there are violations, of course, law firms represent companies before regulators or before courts. Excuse me. Accounting firms are centrally involved in the compliance industry. Accounting firms will also be involved in consulting companies on how to design compliance programs. Accounting firms will do audits of compliance programs. And accounting firms will also be brought in if a violation occurs to try to figure out where the violation occurred, why it occurred, what made it possible, what reforms within the compliance program need to be adopted to prevent this from happening in the future. So you see this industry, this compliance model, can stimulate growth and activity in a number of different sectors. In Brazil, it was very interesting several years ago, about 3 years ago now, to see these corporate law firms whom you would expect would be more protective of the companies and would be more hostile to, would resist anti-corruption reforms, would resist the adoption of new forms of holding companies liable for engaging in corruption. You would expect the corporate law firms to resist those reforms because companies are going to get in trouble, companies are going to pay. It was the opposite. The corporate law firms were some of the most forceful advocates for these reforms. Why? Sorry to be cynical, because they stood to make a ton of money out of this industry. Accounting firms the same way. Do we believe that people in office are acting out of a charitable, philanthropic impulse? No, we believe that people in power tend to abuse their power. And we set up a government so that people who are abusing their power will nonetheless create an outcome that is good for society. A famous political philosopher in the US context, who was the architect of the US Constitution, famously said, "What is government but a reflection of human nature?" People are self-interested. We will use government to promote the public good, despite it being constituted by people who tend to value their own power more than the public good. I want to adopt James Madison and ask, what are the Olympics but a reflection of human nature? All that we are and all that we want to be. And I suggest that despite the deeply imperfect people who manage the International Olympic Games, we can, by appealing to their self-interest, we can use the games to stimulate host country anti-corruption reforms. And I hope and trust that 10 years from now, I can come back with a positive report to that very effect. Thank you very much.